Harvard. And so I have been at Simon-Kucher since graduation, working on a lot of different project types, but particularly lately I've been doing quite a bit of work in the gene therapy space in particular. And this is a space that is personally very interesting to me. I actually interned at Simon-Kucher between my junior and senior years of undergrad. And I remember sitting in my, one of my boss's office, this woman, Allison Dupuy, she's the managing partner of San Francisco, and she heads life sciences for the entire US. And I remember sitting in her office and we were talking about, you know, what the future holds and what things may look like. And I remember her saying to me, you know, at some point we're going to be working on pricing cures. So it's been really cool to have that distinct memory from when I was an intern. And then now at this point, I've worked on multiple projects pricing gene therapies and pricing curative medicines. And so it's a topic that is close to my heart and is also a really, really compelling topic, at least from my perspective. So what we're going to be talking about today is how curative medicines should be valued and how they should be priced. So I know, I'm not sure to what extent different members of your group are aware of the pricing perspective of pharmaceuticals at Simon-Kucher. That's really, you know, the focus of what we do. So throughout the presentation, you'll see that you know, curative therapies are an unbelievable clinical advancement. It's undeniable that they're paradigm shifting. They're really incredible from a science perspective, but they also bring a ton of challenges from a commercialization perspective. And that's just because our healthcare systems, particularly in the US, but also around the world, they're not built to pay for cures. They're built to pay for chronic treatments. So the creation and the commercialization of cell and gene therapies is incredibly exciting from a science perspective, but it's also really challenging from an execution perspective. So I'm going to be focused a lot on trying to explain some of those challenges. So hopefully it's not too pessimistic of a talk, but it's a bit of trying to shed some light on how challenging it is to bring these revolutionary medicines to market successfully, and talk a little bit about the outlook on some solutions to these challenges and how we might be able to overcome the hurdles that have come up so that manufacturers can bring these paradigm shifting medicines to the patients who can benefit from them. So before I start, again, as Sandipan mentioned, if you have any questions, I definitely want to be open to questions throughout the talk. So, you know, if we're sitting on a certain slide and there's something I say that you either want clarity on or you have a comment or a question, feel free to just put it in the chat. If I see things in the chat, I would ask you, you know, I'll ask, you know, who asked the question about this, and then if you could, you know, feel free to speak up and ask that question live, and also provide any other context, anything like that. I do hopefully want to make this an interactive discussion. All right, so we're talking about curative medicines. So what that is going to mean today are primarily cell and gene therapies. So there are actually three groups of curative medicines that have been defined. So the EMA, which is the European Medicines Agency, which is basically the European version of the FDA, has defined three groups. They put them under the bucket of ATMPs, which are advanced therapy medicinal products. But really, all that has happened is that there have been three distinct categories for curative therapies. We're going to be talking about cell and gene therapies today. So this is the first and the second column. I personally have the most experience with gene therapies. So that's what you're going to see. You know, a lot of my examples and my anecdotes will be focused in the gene therapy space. We won't focus too much on this third category of tissue engineered medicines. This is actually a category I don't have much experience. But just wanted to provide a bit of a clinical sense of what we're talking about when we say cell and gene therapies, because there is a distinct difference between the two, and that's also one of the reasons why you see a pretty significant difference in price levels between the cell therapies that have launched to date and the gene therapies that have launched. So cell therapy medicines, which is the first column, these are medicines that contain cells or tissues that have been manipulated to act a certain way. So this is a situation where you take cells or tissues and let's say you manipulate them to be incredibly effective at identifying certain cancer cells, so basically the examples that we have of this to date, there are two products that are cell therapies that are called Kymriah and Yescarta. And both of these products are cancer treatments. One is for leukemia and the other is for a type of lymphoma. So both cancer types. And what basically, how these products work is that they have been, the products themselves are modified cells or tissues that are administered to patients that almost are really, they're almost like trained elements of your immune system to hunt down and to remove and kill the specific cancer cells that are associated with those different cancer types. In comparison to that and the technology behind cell therapies, we have gene therapies. And gene therapies actually work where you take a sample of a patient's genetic material. So it's almost the same steps as if you were giving a patient a stem cell transplant. You take a sample of their genetic material and you actually insert additional DNA. So this is, trying to understand, is their disease state because they're missing certain DNA sequences or they have mutations that are making their DNA sequences not function the right way, and you actually re-add functional DNA into their genetic material and then reintroduce that genetic material into the patient's body. So if their disease state is caused by a mutated gene or the lack of a gene such that, they're not creating the right protein, or they're creating a misfolded non-functional protein, you are actually giving them the DNA they need to start producing the right chemistry. So the examples of gene therapies that we have in the world today are Luxturna, which is a product for a type of retinal dystrophy, which is basically blindness. We have a product called Zolgensma, which is for a disease called SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, which is a fatal pediatric motor disease. And then relatively recently, this product called Zyntenglo, which is for a disease called beta-thalassemia, which is kind of like sickle cell disease. That was actually just EMA approved last year. It has yet to be FDA approved. But basically just wanted to give a little bit of sense for the chemistry, or for the, the mechanisms of how these products work. But both cell and gene therapies, although they work in different ways, they're unbelievable clinical advancements, to really either equip a patient's body with, the genetic material they need to function correctly, or to really be able to, retrain someone's immune system or other cells in their body to function, to either, reverse a disease state or fight against a disease state is absolutely incredible. But both of these types of therapies, both cell and gene therapies, are really new. So if we look at the timing here, there's a very rough timeline. Basically what we see is there were some early products the two that we have on the left-hand side of the screen, Glybera and Strimvelis, these were actually the first of the first. So these were products that were available as early as 2012 for Glybera. So, still within the last decade, but have been around for a while. But the first cell and gene therapies really struggled commercially. And that's been a really important kind of story in this space, how manufacturers, how more recent manufacturers have really learned from the struggles of, the first of the first. So really, I want us to focus starting 2017 and later, because really 2017 was like the big year for cell and gene therapies. You had Kymriah and Yescarta, which are the two cell therapies that are approved around the world right now. And then you also had the world's first gene therapy, which is Luxturna. So 2017 was a big year for those launches. 2018 was kind of the year for everyone to figure out how to use them and how to pay for them. And then 2019, we had the approval of another gene therapy in Zolgensma, as well as Zyntenglo. Looking to the future, the pipeline for cell and gene therapies is incredibly strong. We are looking for, I think there were some expected therapies to launch this year. Remains to be seen if COVID might delay those launches. But we particularly had our eye out for Zyntenglo, which is the beta-thalassemia product, to launch in the US. There's another product that is talked about a lot in the media. It's called Valrox, and this is a product for hemophilia A, which is a bleeding disorder. And then dozens more to come. So overall, this space is still incredibly new. You really just have, the first therapies that have really been commercially successful are still in their third year of commercialization. So this is a really new space. So as I mentioned before, cell and gene therapies are undeniably incredible clinical advancements, but healthcare systems today are absolutely unprepared for the topic of pricing and market access. So pricing and market access is kind of the bread and butter of what we do at Simon-Kucher. So I'm very, familiar with this term, but what we mean by this from a pricing perspective, in most countries around the world, with the exception of the US, pricing for pharmaceuticals is a negotiation where members of the manufacturer team and members of the government organization that is responsible for administering healthcare, those two parties come together and they negotiate for what what is the value of the product and what is the value of that drug or that medical device, whatever it may be. They negotiate what the government body is willing to pay. So connected to that is there can be trade-offs in pricing and things like when we say market access, for example, part of a negotiation tactic might be, if you give me this higher price, you have to restrict your patient population to only these specific patients. Or if you want access to all possible patients, you're going to have to lower your price. It's kind of a trade-off during the negotiations. So what I'm going to do now is kind of explain or try to explain why cell and gene therapies pose such a challenge from a pricing and market access perspective. So the first is lack of long-term evidence. So the key, the crux of what is challenging about cell and gene therapies is they are one-time treatments that are claimed to have curative lifelong benefit. So instead of, a treatment for oncology or high cholesterol or rheumatoid arthritis, where patients are taking their medications for their entire life, Cell and gene therapies, the big claim about them is that patients receive one treatment, they go through like one procedure, and then their disease, which normally is chronic, is cured for the rest of their life. One of the big challenges is that to date, there is a lack of that long-term clinical evidence, because if the claim is that the treatment lasts for the entirety of a patient's life, in order to demonstrate that, you would need to have a clinical trial that spanned 70 years. And a lot of these cell and gene therapies, the gene therapies in particular, are coming out for pediatric diseases. So this is a situation where you might say, I'm going to treat a patient when they're 1.5 years old, and the only way I could demonstrate and prove that it has lifelong benefit is if I did a clinical trial that followed that 1.5-year-old through the entirety of their supposedly normal span of life. And that's just not, it's not realistic, because given the promise of these cell and gene therapies, everyone, the manufacturers, the healthcare system, you want to see them come to market as quickly as you can. So this is a situation where these products claim to have lifelong benefit, but oftentimes their clinical trial is only 3 or 4 years. And so that also leads to, often these trials they have surrogate endpoints. So for example, for a disease like spinal muscular atrophy, so this is that gene therapy Zolgensma, which is targeted for spinal muscular atrophy. This is a disease that is eventually fatal. All children who have SMA will die of their disease, likely before they reach their teenage years. So the claim of a product like Zolgensma is that you administer this drug once and patients will live, have a normal lifespan. But the clinical trial for Zolgensma was, their phase 3 trial was maybe 2 years or 3 years. And the endpoint that was measured, because you can't say, oh yeah, I've proven that these patients have a normal lifespan, they have surrogate endpoints like, do we see an incremental improvement in their motor function? Or do we see where normally patients would clearly and rapidly decline, do we see their condition being stable? So all this is to say is that these are products where what has been clinically demonstrated is not fully matching their claim of lifelong benefit. And we'll talk about, so what that means is, let's say manufacturers and payers, who are, the people who are responsible for paying for healthcare for the members of their country, they get together to negotiate on price. The manufacturer says, I have this curative treatment, but the payer has no proof. They have no proof that the product is really curative. So that leads to a lot of challenges as part of the negotiation process. Another challenge for cell and gene therapies is the high upfront cost. So basically what's happening here is, let's say let's use Zolgensma again as an example. If I'm the manufacturer of Zolgensma, I'm thinking to myself, okay, if SMA patients do not receive my product, instead they are using chronic treatment for the rest of their life. So let's say there's another product out there which is called Spinraza, which is a relatively new treatment for SMA. It's not a cell or a gene therapy, it's a chronic treatment. And this treatment costs in the US like a couple $100,000 per injection, and patients are injected every 3 or 4 months for the rest of their life. So if I am the manufacturer of a gene therapy like Zolgensma, I'm thinking, okay, if they don't use my product, they're going to use Spinraza every couple of months. It's going to cost them a couple $100,000 every couple of months for the rest of this patient's life. So isn't my product worth millions, because you almost do a break even of, let's say, you know, Spinraza would cost $300,000 a year for the rest of their life. Doesn't that mean that my product should be worth millions for a one-time administration? And that's really the crux of the challenge for cell and gene therapies, because healthcare systems are not set up to pay such large amounts at once. They're set up to be able to, I mean, healthcare systems spend billions of dollars a year, but it's very much budgeted for chronic treatments over time. So if you were to ask a payer in Italy or Spain, or, you know, any number of the payers in the US, hey, you normally plan to pay a couple $100,000 a year for this patient for the next couple of years. Instead, can you give me $7 million at once? That's a big cash flow issue, because these payer bodies, they are businesses that have cash flow and they have budgets. So the idea, you know, clinically, the ability to just treat a patient once, as opposed to needing to give them injections every couple of months for the rest of their life, is an incredible clinical development, undeniably, but it raises a big budget challenge based on the way that healthcare systems are currently structured. All right, let me see. Yes, so a good question about the structure of budgets. So it actually varies by country how different healthcare systems think about their budgets. In the US, most healthcare plans are really focused on annual budgets. In some European markets, for example, Italy and Spain are a bit more, they'll focus on the next like 2 to 3 years. But it varies by country. So one of the important things for manufacturers to understand when they try and launch their drug in different countries is, how do the payer bodies in those countries think about their budgets, so that they can really understand what kind of a perspective are payers bringing to the negotiation. Yeah, that was a good question. All right. One of the next challenges about cell and gene therapies is really the uncertainty around the patient population. So this is a really big concern from the payer's perspective, because one of the things that happens is a lot of the gene therapies in particular that have launched are for very ultra rare diseases. And so there's not much that is actually known so well about these diseases across the country and across the globe. So it's a bit uncertain from an epidemiology perspective how many patients are actually out there. There's also a dynamic where these are, for the most part, the gene therapies are launching in diseases that currently have no treatment options. They're also primarily, you know, based on the name gene therapies, these are genetic diseases. But what you see happening is when you talk to clinicians about, you know, do you have any sense for how many of these patients, a specific type of patient, is out there, they'll say, look, if there's no treatment option out there right now, I don't really have a reason to try and, you know, to do genetic testing on patients to try and understand if they have this disease, because I couldn't do anything with that information because there are no treatments. So there's a big fear of payers from the payer side that if a treatment option comes out, then all of these patients are going to come out of the woodwork. and that the budget impact of a treatment is going to be a lot higher than everyone thought, because the fact that there is a treatment now means, okay, as a clinician, it's worth me testing to see if a patient has a specific genetic condition, because now if they do, I can treat them with something. So this is a big factor, and something that's really on payers' minds is the number of patients out there actually a lot higher than what the manufacturer is telling me? And then finally, one point that is actually a bit specific to the manufacturer's perspective is that these are really complicated treatments to administer. They're very delicate treatments because they're all situations where, you know, cells or tissues or genetic material has been, you know, modified in a lab. It needs to be, you know, you need to collect the right samples from a patient. You need to modify their, you know, genetic material or their tissues or their cells in a very controlled setting. And then you need to transport that modified treatment back to a hospital. You need to make sure this is really complicated. It's so much more complicated than, you know, manufacturing and selling a pill or even you know, an IV medicine. And the risk is really high. You know, if you have products that cost millions of dollars, any mistake in that process, like let's say you don't temperature control the treatment as it's going from the lab to the hospital where the patient is waiting to receive it, that can be, you know, either a loss of millions of dollars for the manufacturer who just doesn't make that money, or depending on, you know, what country you're talking about, this could be a hospital who's already paid for the product, and then, you know, handling is misdone, and then that hospital is out millions of dollars. So this is, again, just to try and explain a little bit about why, you know, clinically incredible products, but they really throw a wrench in the way that the healthcare systems around the globe are set up. So the key that we're looking for here is to really find solutions that allow healthcare systems to be able to pay the prices that are an accurate reflection of the clinical value that these products provide. So it kind of goes in a bit of a continuum of, here's the clinical value, here is, you know, the next step is, here is the price that is supported by that clinical value, but then that final step is, can healthcare systems actually pay that price? So one of the last things, let me just check on time, okay, good. One of the last things that I wanted to talk about, so a lot of times the concept of cell and gene therapies, for the last probably 2 years, discussion around these products has really just focused on the challenges, right? So thinking to this last slide, all of the discussion are just people reiterating the same thing about these challenges. You know, there's no demonstrated cure, you know, such a high upfront budget impact, so much uncertainty. So I would say for the last 2 years, the discussion has really been just about reiterating the challenges. But we have seen in the last maybe year or year and a half, people are really trying to then focus their energy on solutions. So, you know, saying, yes, I recognize these challenges are there, and there's no easy answer. There is, you know, healthcare systems are set up the way that they're set up, and they're going to take an incredible amount of effort to adapt to curative therapies. So it's almost a matter of, let me think about all of the things that we could do, all the potential solutions. None of them are going to be easy, but we just have to pick the one that we think will work the best and just start investing time and resources into that solution. But again, There is no perfect solution. So the last thing that I wanted to share with you guys is a bit of a reflection on, here are some solutions that have been commonly discussed to kind of solve for this cell and gene therapy challenge. So I'm going to share a couple of those solutions with you guys and then provide at least my commentary on, you know, is this solution feasible? Is it going to be really tough? And it also differs around the world, what solutions are possible versus not. All right, so what we're going to do, or what I'm going to do is, I'm going to start first with sharing with you guys a particular solution, and then I'm going to share, you know, is this solution feasible in the US? And then I'll focus outside of the US, because it is very, very much the case that given the different structures of the US healthcare system relative to other healthcare systems, there is not one global solution for the challenges of cell and gene therapies. It really needs to be somewhat country specific. So the first kind of general concept that I want to share with you guys is just the general, what is payer appetite to developing solutions to this challenge? So basically in the US so far, payer appetite to trying to figure out ways to, you know, handle clinical uncertainty or handle high upfront budget impact has been kind of low. And the reason that is because, contrary to the majority of the world where healthcare is very centralized, either with a single healthcare body that is responsible for providing healthcare for the entirety of a country's population. There are some countries where responsibility of healthcare is split over a handful of different groups that are responsible for administering healthcare. In the US, it's incredibly fragmented. So you have, you know, over 100 different organizations that are responsible for providing healthcare for US citizens. So what that means is each one of those organizations cares only about the US population that they are responsible for. So some of these organizations are incredibly large. They span patients across the US. They have, you know, tens of millions of members, which are the patients that they serve. But others are really small. You can have these really small regional plans that maybe they're just responsible for providing healthcare for, you know, maybe 30,000 people in a single state in the US. And so what this means is that if you think about the cell and gene therapy population, focus on gene therapies, these are really small patient populations, even on a global level. When you understand that US payers really focus just on the patients that they are responsible for, what that means is that maybe most payer organizations in the US will have maybe 1 or 2 SMA patients who would get Zolgensma, maybe 1 or 2 patients who have the certain type of blindness where they could get Luxturna. So the gene therapies to date have been for really rare patient populations, really small patient populations. So what this means is a US payer saying, okay, you know, I'm only going to get maybe 1 or 2 of these patients in a given year. I can handle paying, so Zolgensma right now, it costs about $2 million in the US. But you have plans who are saying, all right, maybe I'm only going to get 1 patient. So like there, I don't have to change my structure, the way I do things. I'll just pay that $2 million, like I can do that. The challenge in that is that there are gene therapies coming in the pipeline that are for larger patient populations. Hemophilia A, which is the target for that gene therapy Valrox that I talked about earlier, that is a significant patient population in the US, tens of thousands of patients. So we're in a bit of a tricky situation in the US right now where the gene therapies that have been approved to date have been for really small patient populations, and it hasn't been enough to what we call, a lot of payers will say, we haven't reached that tipping point where I really need to figure out how to do things differently, because right now I can kind of handle a patient here, a patient there without really changing anything of the way that I work. So that's kind of a fundamental issue in the US that is proving to be a bit of a barrier to the healthcare system in general, finding it worth their time to invest in, like, let's figure out some solutions. Contrary to that, the more centralized nature of most other healthcare systems in the world, so particularly those in the EU, these are healthcare systems where you have, you know, a single payer body or maybe a handful of payer bodies, and they are responsible for all of the patients in their country. So what this means is that even for more rare diseases like retinal dystrophy or like SMA, beta-thalassemia, because they are responsible for all the patients with that disease in their country, it's a big enough deal for them that they need to start figuring out, you know, how do we solve these solutions? So that's just a little bit of background as to how the structure of the healthcare system impacts, you know, impacts people's willingness to really invest in addressing and planning for anticipated challenges. So when we think about what are some of these solutions, you know, what am I talking about when I say solutions to these challenges? One thing is they're called outcomes-based agreements. So what these are, if you can remember, the first challenge of that 4-column slide was lack of long-term data. So again, these are cell and gene therapies where they're claiming curative benefit, but they have not demonstrated curative benefit. So what an outcomes-based agreement is an agreement between the manufacturer and whoever is paying for the product, that basically the payer will only pay if the product demonstrates clinical benefit. So how this would actually work, it can take a bunch of different forms, but let's say for Luxturna, which is again that product for blindness, what this would look like is maybe, let's say the payer pays the full cost of Luxturna, which is $850,000 USD for 2 eyes. Let's say they pay that upfront, but what they do is the payer then says, I'm going to track this patient, and if, you know, I'm going to check to say that, you know, 3 years after they receive Luxturna, I'm going to do a clinical evaluation, and if this patient isn't continuing to respond to the treatment, I want my money back. So this is something that payers and manufacturers can agree to really acknowledge the fact that manufacturers are asking payers to pay curative prices without having demonstrated and proven curative benefit. So this is an option. This is a solution that's out there. One of the challenging things, again, in the US, based on the fragmented nature of the US healthcare system, setting these up would require the manufacturer to meet with every single payer body in the US and negotiate the terms of such an agreement. So you may have certain plans who will say, I want to check up on patients every 2 years after they receive the treatment, and I want the clinical assessment to look like this. and then you might go to the next payer and they say, oh, I'll just check on the patient at 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and I want to do this kind of clinical assessment. So it's really just a significant investment on the side of the manufacturer to come to an agreement with all of the different payers in the US. Now, given the more centralized nature of the EU, this is a more doable task because you usually, you have to go from anywhere between 1 and, maybe 10 different payer bodies within a country, but it's not hundreds like it is in the US. One of the other solutions that has been discussed is what is called installment plans. So if you think about that second challenge of cell and gene therapies, which is the high upfront cost, asking payers to pay millions of dollars one time as opposed to, thousands of dollars over time, a very logical solution to that is, okay, what if you offer payers an installment plan? And this would allow them to pay a multi-million-dollar bill over time. A very reasonable solution for sure, but the challenge here is that in the US, patients change their healthcare provider many times. So in the US, a patient's healthcare is often tied to their employer. So, I work for Simon-Kucher and I get my insurance from Blue Cross Blue Shield. But if I was to change jobs, my insurance could change. And so it really creates a lot of issues with the installment plan concept in the US, because let's say I was to receive a gene therapy. My current insurer pays, let's say they say, I'm going to spread a millions of dollars treatment over 10 installments of $50,000. Let's say the payer has paid maybe 2 of those 10, and then I change jobs. What happens to the remaining installments? Who is responsible for them? Does my old insurer have to keep paying even though I don't belong to them anymore? Does my new insurer, are they forced to take on those remaining payments on my behalf? So that's another thing that's really challenging in the US is what we call member turnover. And this is really based on the understanding that the average plan membership in the US is 3 years. So a patient is usually with a single insurance company for 3 years, and then because of a change in job or they change where they live, they get a new insurer. So this is a big challenge in the US, less so in the EU. So what you actually see is outside of the US, installment plans might really be one of the things that really takes off in the future. Because that, for as long as a patient lives in France, or as long as a patient lives in England, the same organization will be responsible for paying for their medication. So it really makes something like an installment plan a lot more feasible. And then finally, the last thing that is often discussed as a potential solution for cell and gene therapies is what we call a risk pool program. So what this actually means is this would be a scenario where it's almost like insurance for insurance, or reinsurance. So this basically means that every insurance company or every payer body pays like a regular fee that goes into this pot. And then what happens is that if any payer has a patient who requires a cell or a gene therapy treatment, they can reach into that pot and take the money that they need to pay for that treatment. And why this is beneficial is because particularly in the US, where you can have, like I mentioned, some of those really small plans that are responsible for providing insurance for maybe, you know, a couple thousand people, but not millions. If you ask them, hey, can you pay $3 million right now for Zolgensma or for whatever gene therapy is going to come next, they might say, I don't have the cash. From a cash flow perspective, I can't pay that much right now. So one of the things that is thought is that all payers would put money in the pot, basically, and that's something that they could budget for, because it would almost be like a membership fee to this kind of risk pool where payers will pay this membership fee, and then it's almost like a crowdsourcing of funds. And then if they happen to have a patient who requires a really expensive treatment, like a cell or a gene therapy, they can then dip into that pot and have the funds that they need. This is really something that would be specific to the US, because based on the centralized nature of most other healthcare systems, that pot already exists, because all of the healthcare funding comes from one place. But in the US, it is my personal perspective that this is where we need to go in the US, because of the fact that installment plans are a challenge because of turnover, and executing outcomes-based agreements, it takes a significant amount of time and resources. Also, the thing about outcomes-based agreements is that if the products perform as they are expected to, there's no cost savings associated. So an outcomes-based agreement is really only helpful if in reality these treatments don't work. In which case, it's great that payers aren't paying for treatments that don't work, but if they do work, and hopefully they do, and they work, and they're really curative, there's no cost savings. So in the US, it's my personal perspective that it's really risk pool programs that will be kind of the key solution. They just don't exist in the US right now. So it's a huge mental hurdle to say that, you know, this is maybe the solution that we need, but we are starting completely from scratch. So we need to figure out, how would this look? And there needs to be creation of these risk pool programs that currently nothing. So I know it's not like the most optimistic kind of picture to paint, but I think it's hopefully what I'm trying to communicate to everyone is that there are very clear challenges. I think we've progressed to start thinking about solutions, but you know, you think about these solutions, you think a couple steps ahead, and none of these solutions are perfect and none of them are easy. But it's really, I think, you know, what we're doing at Simon-Kucher is really trying to work with, you know, understanding the manufacturer side and the payer side to figure out, you know, we need to pick one of these things to pursue, because otherwise the healthcare system will go bankrupt, or patients will not get these medications that can really be life-saving and life-changing. So it's about bringing everyone up to speed, acknowledging the challenges, but bringing everyone up to speed on here's where we're at identifying solutions. And then we just need to, at this point, kind of my personal perspective is that, you know, we need to make a decision about which of these solutions in an ideal world will fix our problem, and then just get to work on it. And it's going to be years before these solutions are found. But you know, it's certainly worth it. So it's a big challenge, but one that is very much worth undertaking from my perspective.